Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we are starting a new series on the growth and fracturing of New England. It's been 11 weeks since we've covered Plymouth, and today we return to the colony in the year 1630. The late 1620s stirred up a lot of trouble in Plymouth with Thomas Morton, John Oldham, John Lyford, earlier in that part of the decade, but ended on the opportunity of growth with the Massachusetts Bay Colony starting up nearby. And you can go back and watch our Colonization of New England series to get the coverage and everything that happened in New England in the first 10 years. The new year starts with a man named Ashley showing up, and he is referred to the Plymouth colony by Isaac Allerton. Now, Allerton came over on the Mayflower, so he's been there a while. But Mr. Ashley's behavior draws suspicion right away, and it does so when a shipment does not show up in the spring of 1630, and the colony discovers that it's in the possession of Mr. Ashley. So this new gentleman shows up, immediately raises red flags, and if you'll recall from our Colonization of New England unit, Isaac Allerton himself was beginning to raise red flags as well. The colonists heard of Mr. Pierce arriving with supplies. We think it might be the same Pierce as the Pierce patent, but Bradford did not refer to first names in this portion of the writing. So they heard of a Mr. Pierce arriving with supplies at the new Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they sent a small ship up there to see if he had anything for them, but he did not. The colonists were becoming concerned about Isaac Allerton's behavior, mainly because he was said to have goods kind of either tucked away or out on a fishing vessel, or one thing or another. And so his behavior to the colonists is growing increasingly shady. Finally, Edward Winslow agrees to go back to England with what little the Plymouth colony had to trade for, because Allerton was not delivering. A trading ship called the White Angel then shows up at the Massachusetts Bay during the summer of 1630, and the Plymouth colonists who basically go up there to retrieve their goods, so they have goods on this ship, find out that they're mostly spoiled or have already been consumed. So it's just, it's going from bad to worse, this trade relationship, this business relationship that Plymouth has with Isaac Allerton. Plymouth was getting very weary of Isaac Allerton when all of a sudden he returns from England and explains the problems away, essentially. He has a bunch of excuses, and a new trade agreement is drawn up. Allerton leaves on a fishing expedition, and new information comes to light, casting further doubt on his credibility. His business partner, Mr. Hatherley, who is in Plymouth, gets pressured in regards to what's going on and confesses to something that Bradford refers into the writing as a scheme. So clearly there was some type of either Ponzi scheme or something going on, an embezzlement. Then the colony discovers Mr. Ashley illegally trading ammunition with the natives. He is arrested and sent back to England. Part of the reason why the confession occurred was because Allerton had ripped off his own partners as well. Bradford goes on to indicate Allerton's current status. Let's have a look at the writing. Mr. Allerton was busied with his own affairs and returned with his White Angel, being no longer employed by the settlement. But these troubles were not ended till many years after, nor fully realized for a long time. Isaac Allerton essentially has been terminated as an employee, not kicked out necessarily as a resident of Plymouth, but we'll see how that goes. And so we'll just kind of wait that out and see if something else comes about later. As I had said earlier, Allerton came over on the Mayflower, but he was not the most dramatic of the Mayflower inhabitants that year. A fellow passenger had a more dramatic year than him. Let's have a look. This year, John Billington the Elder, one of those who came over first, was arraigned and both by grand and petty jury found guilty of willful murder by plain and notorious evidence and was accordingly executed. Now, if you'll recall from prior readings, Billington was actually named by John Oldham during Oldham's trial as some sort of co-conspirator, but he was never charged. And it's kind of shocking that this man came over on the Mayflower and then a full decade later is executed for murder. Quite a dramatic turn of events there. Bradford goes on to mention that John Winthrop and others in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were consulted as well prior to this, because it was the first execution in the colony. In 1631, Mr. Ashley dies, likely leaving in just as mysterious of a tone as he showed up, according to reading the writings. Despite being terminated from the colony's trade employment that year, Allerton and the colony's leadership are actually having trouble agreeing to who owns what. And, if you're ever in a business deal and things are done by a handshake and then things fall apart, I'm sure you can relate to the Plymouth Allerton battle here for assets. Bradford goes on a lengthy dissertation of the investigation into Allerton's business activities and all the complications involved in unraveling those. He mentions how Allerton set up his own trading post on the Kennebec River in Maine to compete with the Plymouth colony's post. At some point, the French, who were busy colonizing Canada, came down and attacked the rival post, killing 2 men and creating severe financial losses for Allerton. The French also ended up attacking a Plymouth-owned trading post and seizing 400 to 500 pounds worth of goods. So the French are becoming a little bit of a problem here, but also at the same time, this dissertation in Plymouth Plantation that Bradford goes on, very lengthy and very detailed. And I think that Bradford, when he was writing this book, wanted people to know that Allerton was not reliable, just based on the amount of technical analysis Bradford does that I don't think is worthy for this program, but it is there if you want to read it. In 1631, Governor Winthrop and Governor Bradford found themselves on the same side of a dispute with Captain Mason and Ferdinand Gorges, and you may have recalled those individuals from our colonization of New Hampshire episode. They had some patent claims to the north. While Bradford does not mention the dispute, one can only imagine that it probably had to do with those trading posts in Maine, where Gorges and Mason had patents. And again, I'll mention, if you haven't watched the colonization of New Hampshire episode, you'll be missing all of the context there. The Privy Council ruled on January 19th, 1632, in regards to the Puritans versus Mason-Gorges dispute, and found in favor of the Puritans. So there was no punishment there for their actions. 1632 was a good year for the colony, according to Bradford. Allerton was still operating, but not in the name of the colony. The price of cattle and corn rose nicely, making great trade revenues for Plymouth. The price increase appears to have occurred because of the influx of people into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, necessitating the surplus of food from Plymouth. So Plymouth has a surplus. Massachusetts Bay is seeing this huge push of people. They become the logical trading partner of Plymouth. An odd consequence arose from this influx within Plymouth. Let's have a look at the writing. For as their stocks increased and became more saleable, there was no longer any holding them together. They must of necessity obtain bigger holdings, otherwise they could not keep their cattle. And having oxen, they must have land for plowing. By this means they were quickly scattered all over the bay. So they needed to spread out, essentially, is what Bradford is saying there. And so people were spreading out, and Plymouth, the center of Plymouth colony itself, was being described as desolate. I find it interesting at this point that we are in the early 1630s of American history, and Jamestown is already being described as in poor condition, downtown Jamestown, the original colony, and now Plymouth is being described as desolate because people are spreading out to meet the agricultural needs of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Bradford went on to note that there was a division in the church as well. Duxbury, a sister colony that was set up nearby, decided to separate itself from Plymouth. The colonists responded by offering favorable lands to people who would stay associated with Plymouth, a move similar to how Maryland attracted colonists. Bradford noted that these colonists would later leave the church as well. Apparently, an event in 1632 was absent from Bradford's writings, but it was present in the writings of John Winthrop. Let's have a look. The governor receives letters from Plymouth, signifying that there had been a broil between their men at Samoset and the Narragansett Indians, who set upon the English house there to have taken Osgamquin, the Sangamon of the Pecanicut, who was fled thither with all his people for refuge, and that Captain Standish, being gone thither to relieve the 3 English which were in the house, had sent home in all haste for more men and other provisions upon intelligence that Canonicus, with a great army, was coming against him. So apparently some native tribes and the Plymouth Pilgrims were having some issues with one another, but Bradford doesn't mention this. It actually came up with John Winthrop. And this may be because Winthrop's writings are current, and Bradford is writing in the future reflecting back on the past, so that may have something to do with it. In 1633, William Bradford's 10-year tenure as governor came to an end. The colonists chose a familiar face to replace him as the 3rd governor of the colony, Edward Winslow. That year, Roger Williams came to Plymouth after a 2-year stay in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. A Puritan minister, Bradford refers to Roger Williams as a, quote, godly and zealous man. Bradford adds that Williams has rare qualities but unstable judgment, and he left the Bay Colony after some discontent. Williams joins the church and appears to excel at first, but then, let's have a look at the writing. He began to hold some strange opinions, and from opinion proceed to practice. This caused some controversy between the church and him, and in the end some discontent on his part, so that he left them somewhat abruptly. So Roger Williams, who we'll talk about later because he has some historical significance behind him, leaves after some disagreement. Bradford mentions the migration move towards Connecticut. The Plymouth colony actually establishes a trading post on the Connecticut River in 1633. Bradford goes on to hint that a complex situation is developing where the Dutch and the natives are not happy about the migration of Puritans. So you've got 3 different parties competing for the same lands. The Dutch intercepted the initial Puritan envoy up the Connecticut River and threatened to shoot them. The envoy replied that they were under orders, and they proceeded anyways, with the Dutch thankfully not firing. Later, the Dutch sent 70 armed men to the trading post, but seeing that it was well fortified and well manned, they decided not to engage. A smallpox epidemic hits the colony in 1633 and kills around 20 people, with the natives seeing far greater casualties. In 1634, Edward Winslow's one-year term as governor ended, and Thomas Prence was elected governor. Winslow was not left without a job or responsibility. He was sent back to England to negotiate the paying off of all the colony's debts there. With the smallpox epidemic continuing to rage, Bradford notes that in Connecticut, near the Pilgrim Trading Post, a village of 1,000 natives was reduced to 50, and the Dutch envoy that was staying with them nearly starved to death. Bradford hypothesizes that the reason smallpox was so much harder on the natives was because they did not have linens to rest on, and the sticks and brush that they lay on were harder on their skin. That would be uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Winslow arrives in England, and in 1635 he tackles the issue of French and Dutch aggression with the English government, the French to the north and the Dutch to the south. Winslow does not ask for military assistance. Instead, he asks his government to make peace with these foreign governments. So that's interesting. Winslow is over there asking for help, but he's asking for diplomacy, not military intervention. Plymouth's trading post in Maine was attacked again by the French, and Miles Standish was sent with 20 men to try to recoup the stolen goods, but unfortunately he was unsuccessful. Winslow ends up being jailed while in England, and we don't know why, but was able to return to Plymouth later in the year. The Council of New England, having long been unable to manage the disputes between the various interests, and having these self-governing colonies popping up everywhere, had its charter revoked by the king in June 1635. And that would make sense because the Council of New England was essentially becoming less and less relevant. With the area known as modern-day Rhode Island and Connecticut getting more popular, a hotbed of tension between the natives, English, and Dutch starts to swell up. And we'll see that swell up further at a later date. But now that we've covered 5 years of Plymouth history, we need to get an understanding of Bradford here in his writing about Massachusetts Bay Colony growing. And we'll get that through the eyes of John Winthrop. So next week we go to Massachusetts Bay and see that colony get off to a really fast start. Next time on Historical Context.